Hello, and welcome to this tutorial covering the most common steps required when migrating an existing application from using sp-pnp-js to the @pnp scoped client-side libraries. We will start with the SharePoint Framework web part using sp-pnp-js and look at what updates are required, covering the most common scenarios. First, let's have a look at our current web part before we make any changes. This solution was generated using the No Framework option and updated to show the current web and its lists. We have installed sp-pnp-js and imported some of its functionality into our web part. How we're using it is, firstly, we're setting the active log level to verbose, and we're hooking the sp-pnp-js logging into the SharePoint Framework logging. This is an optional step, but is serving to demonstrate something later. Next, we're doing the required on-init update to provide the SharePoint Framework context to the PNP libraries context. And this is to provide the correct context to the library operating within SharePoint Framework. And finally, we've gotten the web in two different ways. Firstly, we're using the web constructor and giving it the absolute URL from the context itself. This is one technique. And the second technique is we're just using the chained web off of PNP, SP, web, lists, etc. to get all of the lists within that web. So these are equivalent calls, but we're demonstrating two techniques. We're also using the getAs method. So we have a typed object, in this case, a web with a title, and in this case, an array of objects with a title. So let's go ahead and run this. And so we're just going to use gulp serve. Now that our server is running, I've loaded my online workbench. So this is the workbench that's part of my Office 365 tenant. And I can add the web part. We'll find here in the list, Hello World. And you can see we've shown the web title and we've shown all the lists in this web. So fairly simple, but we've shown that it works here in the context of the workbench. Returning to the code, we want to take a look now at what it takes to update this web part to use the @pnp scoped libraries in place of the sp-pnp-js library. The first thing we need to do is install the libraries required. One thing you'll notice when I run this command is that we're installing multiple libraries instead of a single library. This is by design, and this breaks up the functionality from one large library to more smaller libraries, giving you, the developer, more control over what's brought into your projects from within the PNP scope. After running the install command, if we look within the node modules folder, you'll see we now have an @pnp folder, and within that folder, each of the 4 packages that we installed to use, except it's now part of separate libraries. Once we've installed these things, the next step is to update our imports. So the first thing we're going to do is import from @pnp logging the log level, logger, and function listener that we use below. The next piece we're going to import is a util, and that now comes from @pnp common. And we're also going to import, finally, an sp object and the web object from @pnp sp. So we can now remove these imports. And you can see we have replaced our single import with 3 separate imports from 3 separate libraries. Now we need to update the code to make use of these new imports. The first thing to have a look at is there's no changes required for the logger. The logging API remains the same and the class names remain the same. So any logging code you have, once you update the import, no longer requires any further modification. You can use it as is. In our case, we might update our source to be @pnp sp or whatever we might want instead of sp-pnp-js, but this is not required. Next, in our on-init method, you'll note we no longer have a PNP. Instead, we're going to do an sp.setup. And you'll note there's no other changes. We still supply the context to the SPFX context parameter. Now within our render method, we have several changes to make, all of them small, but all of them important. Firstly, there is no longer a getAs method. Due to changes in the TypeScript library, we are able to supply the same functionality by simply replacing it with the get method that now also accepts an optional type argument. No further changes are required there. Next, again, we don't have a PNP, so we'll remove that and we change just directly off of the sp.web instead of having to include the pnp.sp. Otherwise, the API remains the same. I'm going to save those changes, and then once again, I'm going to start the server so that we can see our changes in the workbench. Now that the server is running, we'll return to the workbench, load our Hello World web part, and see that everything works as before. So visually, our changes are invisible to the user and to testers. However, we've updated our code to use the @PNP scoped libraries. And those are all the changes required to cover the most common scenarios when migrating from sp-pnp-js to the @PNP scoped client-side libraries. Thank you for watching this tutorial, and we look forward to hearing any feedback you might have.